Good morning.
Good morning.
Good day, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today to this webinar. I want to thank Kelpie for her presentation today. She is an engineer with 35 years of experience working in sustainability, producing biochar, and she has great experience producing biochar and leading different groups for producing this important product. Um, I will start sharing the screen and thank you for doing this today, Kelpie.
Thank you, Carlos. I'm happy to be here.
We are ready. It will appear soon, the slide.
All right. Well, thank you very much to the Forest Service for sponsoring this and USVI. I'm really happy to be here to share this information with everyone this morning. So I want to talk about how to make biochar in the woods and how we might integrate that with programs that have many social and ecological benefits. Next slide, please. A little bit about me. I have been doing biochar for a long time, since 2008. And I originally worked for the International Biochar Initiative for a few years. And I've been a consultant since 2012 in the biochar world. I have a background also in environmental issues and worked for many years as a forest protection advocate here in Southwest Oregon. And so anyway, next slide, please. This is what I want to cover today. What is the problem that we're addressing? How can making biochar in the woods help? What are the technologies and techniques we're using? And what are the carbon and climate impacts of those? And then I want to talk about some of the opportunities for jobs and training and describe some of the projects that have been implemented on the ground. Finally, talk about what's next. Okay, next slide, please. So what is the problem? Well, we have a wildfire crisis in the Western US and elsewhere also. And, caused by climate change, drought, and also our history of fire suppression, which has changed and altered forest ecologies. And this is a huge problem for us, not only because it's threatening our communities, but it's also a loss of carbon storage. And as these forests go up in smoke, we're realizing that, we need to do a lot more carbon drawdown that we're doing, and the forests are our best hope for that. So, and finally, related to these other things, forest health is becoming more and more of an issue. So returning that frequent fire back to fire adapted forests is a really important objective. Next. Fire adapted soils need biochar. We've discovered, researchers who have looked at the char content in these forests find it's quite high, and that the fact that we've excluded fire and the recent soil horizons are missing the char component, this has unknown consequences for soil health. Next. As I said, these forests naturally have a lot of char in them from the fire history. Researchers have found that up to 50% of the carbon in forest soils is charcoal. And so, natural wildfire does leave behind considerable deposits of charcoal. Next. And, here's the problem in a nutshell. These high severity megafires that we're seeing now are really unnatural, at least to the extent that we're seeing them. This was the fire that blew through my neighborhood in 2020. And you can see that, yes, there's some char that was made, but there's not a lot of soil left. So, so we have to address this fire problem, and we really, we can't just, ignore the problem. So how are we doing this? There's two main methods. One is pre-fire vegetation management, where we hope that we can reduce fuels in critical areas to the extent that we could moderate fire behavior. And then there's post-fire management, because fire leaves behind a lot of dead material that has to be dealt with. It's really, a continuing hazard. I know when I told my mother I was going down to Paradise to help people do recovery from the fire making biochar, she said, well, didn't that place burn up? What's there to char left? And I had to let her know that fires, when they come through, they don't burn everything to ash. There's a lot of dead trees and dead biomass left on the ground that has to be dealt with. So the question is, how can we leverage these mandatory activities to do something that improves the soil? So the goal ultimately is to return the forest to frequent low intensity fire regime. And for instance, where these natural fire regimes are in place, these areas will have a lot more char than the sites where fire is excluded. So there's two options we can use at this point to increase the amount of char in the soil as we do these fuels reduction activities. So one is forest thinning followed by prescribed fire. And the other one is forest thinning followed by biochar production in the woods. And we may want to use a combination of these techniques to bring the char component back to forest soils. Next.
Is there?
Next
you can
slide.
continue. Yeah, you can continue. Is there?
All right, so it's queued up. But next slide. I need the next one, please.
It's in return of forest to frequent low intensity.
Next one after that, please.
Okay, I'm sorry.
That's okay. Okay, so so if we're going to undertake this to during our fuels reduction activities, we want to try to make char as a part of that. Why would we do this? What are the overarching goals and what are the strategies? So the four goals that I see that are like immediate goals are, first of all, and I haven't talked about this yet, but we do have burn pile impacts. So we want to avoid those impacts from the conventional burn piling while we reduce fuels. Second, we want to sequester carbon in the biochar and hopefully get paid for it. Third, we want to improve forest soils and forest health. And finally, all of this takes people. And so we want to provide jobs with economic and social benefits. So the strategies that we would use for this would be to use the biochar burn techniques that, first of all, reduce smoke emissions, and second of all, avoid burn pile scars, which is the loss of organic soil from the burn scar. And then for carbon sequestration, we'll not only make biochar in the woods, but we'll leave it in there. We'll leave it on site for easily measurable carbon sequestration. And the thing about making biochar is that you can measure it. You can measure the volume of it, and then you know how much carbon you have sequestered. It's very tangible, unlike some other forms of carbon sequestration. So we want to sequester the carbon and get paid for it by making biochar, and then we want to improve forest soils and forest health by leaving it on site. So that's the two-step process of sequestering carbon and improving forest soils. And then finally, making biochar provides jobs for youth crews, forestry contractors, off-season firefighters, and others who want to engage in this work. Next. So now I'm going to cover how to make biochar in the woods. And I'll first talk about the technique, the overarching technique of flame carbonization. And then I will talk about the two different methods that we're using, the conservation burn and the flame cap kilns. Next, please. So, but before that, I want to tell you how not to make biochar. This is very important because a lot of people who think about making biochar, the first place they went was to look at, well, how is charcoal made? Fuel charcoal. It's something humans have been doing for thousands of years. So there's a lot of different techniques for making fuel charcoal. The thing is, fuel charcoal is really different than biochar because it's really high in condensed volatiles. So if you take a piece of lump hardwood charcoal that you would use in a barbecue grill, you'll see it's kind of dense and heavy. And that's because it's made at a low temperature in a smoldering process. So it's made without flame. and the process for making it is highly polluting. So it's something we definitely want to avoid. And so, you know, there are many ways of doing this, and we don't want to do any of them because they all involve emitting a lot of smoke. Next. Here's the way we do want to make biochar in the woods. So this is called flame carbonization, and it is a form of pyrolysis. It actually could also be considered a form of gasification. And we're making biochar in an open flame. And the way this works is simply because of the nature of combustion of wood and biomass. It burns in several stages. The first stage would be drying, and you can see that pile that's burning up there, that with all the smoke, a lot of that is steam because the water comes out as soon as you heat biomass. And then once the water is out, you get more and more of the hydrogen containing gases that actually burn in a flame. Those are the volatiles. And those are the things we are trying to separate from the carbon. So whenever you see a flame, that's gases burning. Now, once the gases are all gone, the flame goes out and you get to the glowing coal stage. And you see that in your barbecue grill. That's that, you know, intense radiant heat that you use to cook your food. But in the process of that, it goes to ash. So we simply want to cut the process off between volatiles burning and flaming and char combustion to ash. Another way to look at this is we're burning away the outside of a log or a stick in order to char the inside. And so that means that when you're doing this process, small pieces or medium-sized pieces are going to char more efficiently than huge logs. So we don't generally try to do this with really big logs. Okay, next slide. So the first method we looked at was, well, what can we do with what's already there? We've got all these burn piles on the landscape. And so we did a lot of experiments with lighting piles on top to keep the flame strong and reduce smoke emissions, and then quenching the piles with water to save the biochar. And you can see here, I'm looking at a pile of biochar. It came back a year later after we did one of these piles, and all these things are growing in it. So, you know, we really did a favor for the soil by doing this. Next. And this just illustrates the difference between lighting it on the bottom and lighting it on the top. You know, a lot of us have this impression that heat rises, so you should light a pile of biomass at the bottom and let the heat rise up and catch the rest of it on fire. And you know, it's sort of true in the sense that hot air rises, but if you can start the fire on the top or close to the top and get a good strong flame going, that flame radiates in all directions. So the heat's going to transfer downwards. So you can burn from the top down. And when you have that flame in place, it burns the smoke and it provides more heat. So that's the number one piece of this technique. Next. And here's just an illustration of what happens in the conventional jackpot burn pile. These piles are constructed very tightly so that they will burn down into their own footprint and not fall apart. And that's important when you've got 100 piles an acre. And the way these are done is you go through and you light each pile on fire, you let them burn down, they burn all the way to ash, they consume all the fuels. They do a very good job of that. However, they also, as I said, generate smoke, and they create these burn pile scars that can take quite a while to heal. And we're not doing any favor for the forest soils. Next. So we've been trying different ways to get this water out there because, of course, that's a logistical problem. In many cases, we could get a water tender, but we tried to see what we could do with a backpack pump. And, you know, we can put one of these out with 5 gallons of water if we rake it thin. Next. And so this shows the difference between a standard pile not quenched on the bottom and one that we raked and quenched. And what you see when you scrape away the char is unburned fir needles. So the soil's fine. Whereas in the conventional pile, you can see it made some char, but it also made a lot of ash, and it burned up a lot of organic soil and a lot of biology And so this last step of the char burning to ash, that's what really hurts the soil. The flame does not heat the soil that much. It's the actual stage of burning the char where the soil is heated and destroyed. So if we can stop that last stage, we can save the soil. Next. And it's just another picture of coming back a year later and seeing what's growing in one of the piles that we quenched. Next. So we've also been experimenting with different styles of piles, you know, to see if we if we can construct piles that work better for this conservation burn technique. And you can see a couple in the upper left. There's one of my ring of fire kilns, and then in front of that is a rick pile. So it's stacked in crisscross like a log cabin. And then in front of that, there's a pile that's more like a teepee formation with all the big logs angled in. And so the top row of pictures shows the rick pile burning down, getting to the glowing coal stage and then being put out. And then the bottom row shows this teepee style. Kind of liked that teepee style because there was mostly small material on the inside with big logs on the outside. And you can see the bigger ones didn't really burn all the way to char, but the stuff in the center was very well charred, and it made a lot of biochar. And it just brings up another point that the bigger logs, we don't have to consume all those to deal with the fuels problem. We can leave those half-burned logs on the landscape, and they're not a fire danger because it's the fine fuels that are really the fire danger. And those big logs have value on the landscape. So, you know, we can be selective about what we really feel that we need to treat. Okay, next slide. And so another point here in terms of the labor, you know, we light one of these conservation burn piles and you see the arrows show the little patches of char. And then at the end, we put it out with water, and so we're done. The pile on the right that's still smoking, that's one we left to just do the conventional way, and that the people are standing around there. And that's a big pile of ash and destroyed soil with some logs still smoldering there. And because we didn't use the water, the crew will have to come back and check on that that evening, and they'll come back the next day too and check on it, make sure it's all out. So yes, we've consumed our fuels, but we've also made more work for ourselves in a sense because we have to keep checking on these things. Next. So now I'm going to talk about method number 2, which is using what we call a flame cap kiln, which is basically a burn pile in a bin. And the idea came from this Japanese cone kiln that, you know, I saw lots of pictures of, but very little explanation of how it worked. So I made one of my own. I couldn't make the cone shape, so I made an inverted pyramid shape that you see on the right. And I called it a flame cap kiln because you can see how the flame is kind of hugging the material there. It's like a little cap on top. And that happens because all the air comes from the top. So there's no air coming from the bottom. There's no air to pull, you know, smoke, flames and embers and material out of the kiln. It all comes from the top, so it keeps it all very nicely contained. And it makes char because the pan is excluding air from the sides and the bottom. The flame on top uses up all the oxygen. And so the char keeps accumulating in the bottom of the bin, and you keep loading it until it's full of biochar. Every time you put in a new layer of material, it bursts into flame and burns, you know, starts burning the material on top. The stuff on the bottom is protected from the air because it's just not getting down there. And then at the end, when it's full of biochar, you just put it out with water. Next. So this is the kiln that I'm currently selling. It's a design that's evolved over quite a few years. And one of the features of it is it has the heat shield. So that really improves the efficiency. And we can make 1 to 2 cubic yards of biochar in this in about 4 hours. And that depends a lot, of course, on the condition of the fuels. Next. This is how it works. The heat shield does a couple of things. It holds in heat. It also preheats combustion air, because you can see that air is coming up in the annular gap between the two rings, and then it gets sucked into the kiln and increases the efficiency of the kiln and also helps it burn cleaner. Next slide. This shows how the kiln tends to kind of suck smoke back into it. So that the sticks that are sticking out of the kiln that are smoking, the airflows are such that it tends to pull the smoke back into the kiln and burn it. Next. And here's just showing the steps, the production process. You initially load the kiln, you light it, then you load it continually. It helps to have a few people to, because you need to drag the feedstock from a ways away sometimes. So you've got to have a method for forwarding that feedstock. It'll use about 7 to 8 times the volume of a feedstock in the kiln. And then at the end, it's in panels, so you pull the panels apart and you can rake it out and spray it with water and quench the char. Next slide. Again, here's just some statistics on the size of it. It is expandable because it's made with these modular panels. And so if you're interested, give me a call and we can get you one or more of these. Next slide. One of the neat things about the kiln is that it's really easy to measure the amount of char you made. So it just happens, because it's a 6-foot diameter, that a 1 foot height in the cylinder equals about a cubic yard of biochar. And the geometry is easy for whatever size of kiln you have. You can easily figure out the volume of char. And then if we make some assumptions that, for instance, a cubic yard of biochar weighs 250 pounds, then 8 cubic yards of biochar would weigh 2,000 pounds or a ton. And a rule of thumb that we're developing is that 1 ton of biochar is about equal to 2.5 tons of sequestered carbon dioxide. So at the end of the day, you can tell your crew, hey, we sequestered a ton of CO2 or 2 tons of CO2 today. And that's important for funding the work with carbon credits that are now starting to come online. It's also important for motivation. Next, please. All right, so now let's look at these techniques. First of all, the conventional pile burn, and comparing that to the conservation burn and the flame cap kiln. What are we looking at in terms of costs, and what are we looking at in terms of benefits or outputs? So if you look at the conventional pile burn, we're not spending anything extra on equipment. Mobilization is low. It's just a standard forestry crew that does the work. And so compared to the others, the labor cost, it's not actually low, but compared to the others, it's lower. Then what do you get for that? Well, you get fuels reduction. So that's a positive. But you have harm to soil, you have high emissions, you don't make really any measurable biochar, and of course you don't make any carbon sequestration. Now with the conservation burn, we need a little bit extra equipment because we need the water tender. And so that's a little bit more mobilization, and it takes a little more labor to tend and put out the piles. And then what you get for that is you get beneficial soil impacts, you get lower emissions, and you do get some carbon sequestration. So that's the first step, I think. And in a lot of places, conservation burn is really the best you're going to be able to do. And that's fine. I really want to promote the conservation burn concept. Now, if you want to do better than that, if you have the ability, then using a kiln, flame cap kiln. So again, it's a little extra cost because you need not only the water tender, but you need some kilns. And then, you know, again, a little bit more mobilization, but really it's not that difficult to transport the material out there. But you do need more labor, usually quite a bit, because you know, it just takes humans to move that material to the kilns. Now you get a little bit of a trade-off that's not shown here between burn piles and flame cap kilns, depending on how you can stage the materials. So one of the labor costs for conventional burn piles is making the piles, and that can be half the cost. So if you're not trying to construct those really tight jackpot piles, you could save a lot of time by just staging your feedstock in loose windrows, or even leaving it on the ground and gathering it later. So there's a bit of a trade-off there that we should acknowledge. And then of course you get maximum benefits to soils, very low emissions, and a lot of biochar and carbon sequestration. So for high benefits, you have some high labor cost. So let me address that now in the next slide. Because, you know, this work does take people, and we have a precedent for mobilizing people. We have people who need work. And so this is where the idea of the Civilian Conservation Corps comes in, something that was done in the 1930s to address ecological crises in the country with, you know, the Dust Bowl and other issues, and also to address an economic crisis. So we've done this before, and I think, you know, it really merits, given the crisis of our forests and climate and wildfire crisis, it really merits this kind of program to be developed again. Next slide. There's so many benefits, not only to the forest, not only to the climate and ecosystems, but also to our workforce and our youth. So this idea of a carbon conservation corps, a service year for young people where they can improve forest health and protect their communities from wildfire, gives them a chance to be a hero. And so this is great work. Being outdoors, you know, it's fun, people enjoy it, and it's just a good thing to do. So this picture here from the Loma Katsi Restoration Project, I've worked with quite a bit here in Southern Oregon, a really inspiring group of people who've been doing a lot of this kind of forest restoration work for many years now. And there's so much to do and so much more that we can be doing. Next slide. So who can benefit from this? So, you know, we've got all the forestry contractors, the wildland firefighters who work so hard all summer during the fire season. You know, this is an opportunity for them to have good employment year-round. Arborists, professional arborists who work in cities, workforce development programs who are trying to, you know, get youth involved in work. Environmental NGOs, natural resource agencies like the Forest Service, forest landowners, people who live in the WUI, and also the urban aspect of this, because we have quite a lot of biomass and forest in urban areas that also needs to be addressed. Next slide. We have some opportunities. USBI sponsored a day-long webinar this January. Those recordings are now available. You can check those out, and you can hear from a lot of the practitioners on the ground and some of the agencies, and just, you know, hear from the people who are doing this. I offer training. I have a kind of a list I'm developing of practitioners and consultants who are qualified to train people in these techniques. So please contact me for those references. We also have a discussion forum, Biochar in the Woods discussion forum, and there's the link there to subscribe. And so please join us, because we are, you know, having online discussions, and we also have a monthly Zoom call where we get together the first Wednesday of the month and exchange ideas and try to problem solve together. So, this is an active network, and we welcome you to join us. Next. Now I'm going to talk about just a couple of different projects, and this is only a sampling of what's going on right now, but there's one of the most recent thing I was involved in was for the second year here now, we've done a natural resources on-ramp camp with a local group here called Project Youth Plus. And this grew out of a local economic development effort that was looking at employment and needs in our area, and we need firefighters. And during fire season, often a lot of our firefighters are brought in from outside the local area, and so we need more local people to step up and take this on as a career. So that's how this on-ramp camp got started, to introduce youth to these natural resources careers. And so we've been doing a day of biochar as part of that. So first this year, first thing we did is we used biochar that we made the year before in planting holes for willows in stream restoration. And then we spent a day making biochar in a couple of different methods, the kiln, the ring of fire kiln, and also in what we call a swamper burn, which is a burn pile, but where you keep dragging and throwing more material on it. So it's like a conservation burn, but it's actually like a burning in a kiln, but without the kiln, and that can work quite effectively in many cases. So that was a fun week with these youth, and I think we try to make sure everyone has a good time, so they know how much fun it is to work in the woods. Next. Now here's a bigger project that's ongoing. These statistics are from 2021, and Karen Youngblood, who's the forest conservation specialist at the Redwood Forest Foundation, provided these statistics to me. They've been working with a California Conservation Corps crew. So we already have a lot of these youth conservation corps, and a fair number of them are starting to get involved in biochar. So you can see her stats there. They worked for 18 days making biochar last year, and that included doing the work of cutting and piling, and they made a total of 143 cubic yards of biochar. That totals up to 38 tons of CO2. So that's really interesting, and it's great that they're collecting the data and now applying the biochar in their tree planting efforts. So they're really doing the whole process. Next. Here's another project on the San Juan Islands in Washington State, Kai Hoffman-Kroll. He works for the San Juan Islands Conservation District, and he has started a program where he's bringing in college students from Western Washington University for a semester, and they get college credit for learning how to do all these different ecosystem restoration techniques. And they also get a stipend, and they live together, they camp together, and they're mostly using the conservation burn technique. They have a contract with the local power company to clear around power lines, so that's obviously a high priority project. And they're using the conservation burn technique. As I said, they're doing some experimenting with pile construction. And so this is an ongoing program. Next. We also have some tribes that are getting involved in this. The Potter Valley Tribe in California held a day last year, an education day. They have a lot of lands that they're managing. They have a couple of these kilns. The teacher here, Watamakvia, he's one of our trainers, and he does a really good job of not only covering the burning techniques, but also how to use the biochar in agriculture. Next. And here's a project that took place this fall. Mark Vandermeer, Watershed Consulting, another trainer who's available, and you know, can really show people how to not only use the kilns, but probably how to design a whole project. So again, he did a great job of data collection here. This was a 21 acres of forest. And here's an example where they did not pile the material at all. So they saved the labor of piling. They cut it, they let it sit on the ground and season for a few months, and then they just came in and collected it. And you can see in his summary data here, area treated per kiln, the last line there, 20 to 25% of an acre. So that means that they set up a kiln and they'll be drawing material from about a quarter of an acre to feed that kiln. So that gives you an idea of how far they're having to haul stuff. And you know, you can haul by hand, you can also use an ATV. There's lots of different ways to move material. So he'd be a great one to talk to about actually designing a whole project. It's also interesting to look at his stats, biochar yield per acre, so 5.4 cubic yards per acre. And he boiled that down to a cost of biochar per cubic yard, $376. And that's interesting because right now, if you were to go out and buy bulk biochar by the yard, it would cost about $100. And then you would have to transport it to the place where you're going to use it. So that probably about doubles the cost of it. So by making it in place, you know, it costs a little extra, but you also have taken care of your fuels problem. So you got a lot of other benefits there too. So it's really interesting when you start to try and really figure out the cost of these things. Okay, next. And here's an example of some companies that are trying to start up to do this work. So Ecolog was started by this is in my neighborhood, my friend Sean Hendricks, who works for Grayback Forestry as a base commander. And he's been great over the years because anytime I had a new kiln I wanted to try out, he let me come, you know, to one of their sites where they were burning piles, and I could just try the kiln out. And so he's been really supportive. And this is his son Trey, and they are trying to start a little company, Ecolog, and they see that there's definitely a need for this service, mostly for private landowners. And they like the kiln as firefighters because it's safe. Having the water on hand, you know, our local fire department has always been very supportive as well because, you know, people burn piles in their yards all the time here, and every year, few of them get away. And if you have the hose on hand and you have it in the container, it's so much safer as well as being cleaner. So they would love to be doing this work as a business, but we need the demand. We need the programs that are going to pay for it. Okay, next. This is Ari. I really want you to hear what Ari has to say. So she's just a young person in Nevada City, California, in the Sierra foothills, where the problem of fuels is getting quite intense. And so she got inspired. She got a kiln, and she said she's made biochar 56 days this year, starting in January until April. And she just first started going around to people who had burn piles and saying, "Hey, can I turn your burn pile into biochar?" And after a while, you know, the neighbors started seeing what she was doing and they started paying her. So she is making some money doing this. And she says, "My dream is to have people out in the forest cleaning brush, making biochar, work that our neglected, overgrown, and seriously unmanaged fire threat of a forest deserves. With the time and effort I've put into clearing brush and making char with just a couple of friends, we can clear and treat about an acre in 3 days and make about 10 yards of biochar." So imagine the huge difference we can make with more people and more kilns. There's a lot of people out there willing to learn and help with the collective goal of carbon sequestration and managing our forests. We just need to get organized and make it happen. There is no planet B. So I asked her, what kind of help do you need to make your business successful? And, there's a lot that she needs. She needs probably business development help. She needs funding, obviously, and getting more professionals involved in bringing this knowledge to the public. So I find Ari very inspiring, and she's not the only one. There's a biochar coalition in that county and in the neighboring Butte County, and these young people are really dedicated to this work because they see their future going up in flames right now. A lot of them are young organic farmers. They're trying to start businesses, and the fire threat is just dominating everything in their lives right now. Okay, next slide. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about the potential for urban biochar. I was asked to come and bring a kiln to Eugene and Springfield, Oregon last fall. They have these poplar plantations that are part of their water treatment system, and they end up with a lot of slash from harvesting the poplar. So we did a day of biochar there to see if there's another way to deal with the slash besides just lighting these giant piles off. And we had a Northwest Youth Corps help us out there. Next. So what is next? Well, we need to spread the word about this, that we can do this. And we need to make sure that the agencies and the community groups and the individuals who want to do the work are supported and funded. One of the things that's really important is I've kind of talked about going along here is measuring the benefits and the impacts. So we need to refine the carbon accounting protocols so we can tap into some of those carbon markets, but we also need to count all the benefits to what we're doing. So to soils and forest health, to air quality, to rural development and youth empowerment. Because if we really properly document those and account for those, I think we'll find that these kind of programs are really a bargain and a really good investment. I can kind of, see what's going on nationally just by sales of my kiln. It's been on the market for about 1.5 years now. You can see I've sold a lot of them in California, Oregon, Louisiana. There, I just have an order for 20 kilns that's going to go to a NRCS Conservation Innovation Grant program to get them out to small farmers in Louisiana. And then in the West, but also in the East, I'm starting to hear from more and more people in the Midwest, Wisconsin especially, but in the East, New York, Virginia, South Carolina, lots of places are going to find a need and a use for this kiln. So next. I'd like to acknowledge the many people, groups, community groups, agencies, and just individual small woodland owners who have been involved in developing these techniques. And so just too many to name here, but really this is a big community of people now that's really interested in making biochar in the woods. Next. All right, that's it. Please check out my wilsonbiochar.com website. I have a lot of information up there. Please also visit the U.S. Biochar Initiative website, where we have a learning center database with lots of information on biochar. And if you want to talk to me more about any of these things, feel free to send me an email, use the contact form on my website. And thank you so much for your attention today and your interest in this topic.
Thank you, Kelpie. I'm going to move to questions. I need to stop the sharing. And I will share your face. So if you have questions, please place them in the chat for questions and answers. I see some. Will this webinar be recorded? Yes, I will set the link. We will post it also in something called Forestry Webinars webpage. It's a webpage that is hosted by Georgia University and North Carolina State University. And we post all our webinars there with them. There is a question, will seasonal burning reduce the organic loss?
Seasonal burning?
Mhm.
Well, I'm not sure what that means. Is that prescribed burning? Is that what they mean? Possibly. I think that's maybe what they're referring to. Um, prescribed burning and conservation burning and burning in the kilns, I see it as a continuum. So, depending on the site, just simply lighting the landscape on fire, of course, is an old technique that's been practiced by humans for forever. And in the right conditions, it can be very beneficial and can produce a lot of char. And the intent is to do it as a healing process, I believe.
Thank you. The next is, what will the amount of biochar produced and spread across the landscape need to be to make a greater benefit? Is there a test you can use to provide the needed amount? How is the organic matter percentage related to the amount of biochar needed for increasing the health of a soil?
That's such a site-specific question. It's really hard to answer because it completely depends on the local site. So I think it's not so important to know what the optimum application rate is, as just to recognize that we have a severe deficit of carbon in many soils. And so, yes, you can have too much biochar, but we're not likely to have too much in this context. So that's about the only way I can really answer that question. In an agricultural setting, of course, that's very different. And there are application rates for biochar. And I would encourage people to look at the US Biochar Initiative website to find, we have got links there to the Biochar Atlas, which is, an online tool where you can look at soils and crops and get an application rate for biochar.
Thank you, Kelpie. There is another one that says, I need to rewatch and share this excellent presentation. Will be a recording be available? I say yes. What funding sources might be leveraged to start this work?
Well, that's a really good question. There are some NRCS programs, or one NRCS program for private landowners. It's through their conservation stewardship program. So there's a cost share that will help pay for the cost for making biochar in the woods. So if you have if you're a private landowner and you're are involved with the NRCS already doing conservation practices, that can be available to you depending on where you are. Not every state offers it, but check with your local NRCS for that. Other than NRCS, there's not any really solid programs in place yet to fund this. So, but check with your local conservation district and see there might be some funds available.
Thank you. What is the cost of the flame cap kilns and the price of biochar that can be sold?
So I'm selling the kiln right now for $12.95, the Ring of Fire kiln. You can also make your own. I have some plans available online. It's not the same kiln, but there, you can make your own flame cap kiln if you're so inclined, or you can buy one from me. And then the cost of biochar, it depends on where you are in the country. where I am, we have some big biochar producers. And so I can get a cubic yard tote bag of biochar for $100, $125 a yard. Other places in the country, there aren't any local biochar producers, so you could buy it, but it would cost you a lot to ship it. In terms of selling it in the retail market, it's all over the map. Again, like depending on where you are. So I've advised a lot of people who want to get into this kind of small scale that what their best option might be is if they make biochar, and you're not going to make huge amounts of biochar using these techniques as a small business, but you can take that biochar that you do make and use it to make a soil blend or a compost or a worm, worm compost. So you can add value to it by adding organics, and you could make some really valuable soil amendments and soil blends using biochar as one of the ingredients. So that's what I often recommend to people who want to get started in a small business making and selling biochar.
Thank you. There is another question that is kind of long. And then there are others that I will say you can send them to me at carlos.rodriguez-franco@usda.gov or to Kelpie to kwilson@gmail.com, and we will answer them. I'm saying this because I will have to jump 2 minutes before 12 to go to another meeting. Well, the question that I was going to say that is from Adam Chambers is actually two questions. Typically, the weight of carbon amendments do not count toward carbon offsets. Another group could simply deposit manure or topsoil on the same land and get credit for the carbon deposits. But that is not typical accounting. The important accounting is associated with the soil organic carbon accumulation that the amendment causes to occur in the system and not the carbon deposits. Are there really carbon credits being purchased? Which protocol registry?
So the question is about carbon credits and biochar, and I have to say, I don't know a lot about carbon credit programs. They are just starting. I have not put a lot of effort into trying to understand them at this point. I've been putting my effort into learning how to make biochar and how to measure it. So yeah, I guess the question was also about adding manure and labile carbon. So there's two kinds of carbon in soils. Basically, there's labile or degradable carbon that microbes can eat, and that's very important. And there's also stable carbon, and that's biochar or humic substances that don't degrade very quickly. And you really need both for healthy soil. So I'm a big advocate of taking the biochar and adding it to the manure and then putting it in soil. And then you have something that's going to be both stable and usable by soil microbes. So it's really not an either or question. It's both and.
Thank you. Another question is, some of the piles you are making look like a great structures for wildlife. What is more beneficial, leaving the piles for wildlife or burning them for biochar?
Well, if it's always fine to leave a few piles, and often people do leave a few for wildlife. But if your goal is to reduce fuels in the forest because you're worried about a fire coming through, then you definitely want to convert most of them to biochar. Another issue is that if you have a big pile in the forest and then wildlife are living in it and a fire comes through, they're going to be torched. So, leaving a few small piles for wildlife is great, but you don't want to create a trap for them either.
So this is, thank you. This is the last question. before I close, is from Adam Chambers. Second question, ambient air pollution is a large concern. This is clearly a source of nitrous oxides and particulate matter. Do you ensure that these open piles are only burned in EPA-designated attainment zones for ozone and particulate matter?
That's a really good question. Well, the thing that we really need to consider is what's the baseline. So right now we have agricultural open burning is permitted most places in certain, under certain restrictions. But agricultural open burning is something that's generally permitted in the country, as long as it's not, outside of the certain times and where it's permitted. So, and it's very smoky. So what we're doing is we're looking at that baseline and we're saying we can do better. So yes, we're making emissions, but it's less than agricultural, general open burning. So, there you go. There's always trade-offs.
Thank you, Kelpie. I just want to thank you for your great presentation and your great amount of information you provide us today. And I will send you the link when this is posted for you to put it in USBI, and also we will place it in Forest Service webpage and the forestry webinar webpage. You can Google that one to find it. And I want to thank everybody for making it to the end with us, and have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Carlos. Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.